If you have your Bible, go ahead and open up to Esther chapter 6. Esther chapter 6, we're going to dive in and go through this chapter together. I do have a handout for you. If you haven't gotten one, feel free to go ahead and come up and grab one that we'll be working through together tonight. But one of the many things that we've been learning through our study of Esther this year is that there are absolutely times in our lives where it can be difficult to see where God is working, or to see what God is up to. I mean, would you agree with that? That we've seen that in Esther, that it's not just right there jumping off the page. We don't see the name of God mentioned. We don't see any, other than that brief time where we see them fast, but there's no reference to prayer or sacrifice. So we don't really, just at first glance and at first reading of this book, we don't really see the hand of God in some supernatural, miraculous way. I mean, we're used to stories in the Bible like the Gospels, and we studied through Exodus on Sunday mornings a year or so ago, and we're used to seeing all these incredible acts of God. Well, Esther is very different. We don't see that. And that's been kind of a theme that we've tried to take and apply into our own lives to say, there are times in our lives, seasons that we go through where sometimes it's difficult to see what God is actually up to. Sometimes we think we know what He's doing, and things are going in a course, and we're like, yes, this is right, this is good, God is at work here. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, things don't turn out how we anticipated them to turn out. Sometimes we're in the midst of a difficult season or a difficult situation, and we can see that light at the end of the tunnel. And just when we think we're moving out of the woods, just as we think we're about to the end of that season in our lives, all of a sudden, boom, something else hits. Life just doesn't always make sense. We can't always look at everything that's happening and completely in the middle of it, completely understand what God is up to. And I would even go a little bit further to say, we might even go our whole lives and that take place. I'm reminded of Hebrews chapter 11, and those that are in the hall of faith that we read about, and their names are not mentioned there. And they reference those that were persecuted and that were martyred, and that in this life they didn't receive the answer or the promise that they were looking for from God. And so that may be true for some of us as well. We may go all the way through our lives and continually wonder, God, what are you up to? What are you doing? And the book of Esther is full of these kinds of things. I mean, we've seen it over and over and over again. A lot of bad things happen to Esther, to Mordecai, to the people of Israel, and they really don't make any sense if you place yourself within the story. Now, we have the great privilege of looking back, seeing not only the full story of Esther unfold, but actually the full story of God's salvific history unfold in the Scripture. And so we're in a little bit different perspective than Esther would have been in, and Mordecai would have been in, or the Jews would have been in as they were living in this time. But if you place yourself right in the middle of the story, you kind of struggle to see, what is God up to? Mordecai, what does he do? He saves the king's life. And instead of being rewarded, this man named Haman, who is Mordecai's enemy. Not only is he his enemy then, but they have a long family history of being enemies. This man named Haman, instead of Mordecai being rewarded, Haman is promoted to second in command in all the kingdom of Persia. And Haman talks the king into issuing a decree that every single Jew in the Persian kingdom would be annihilated. Well, thankfully, in the providence of God, Esther, this Jewish orphan girl, has been chosen to be the queen of Persia. She has this inside track to the king. And in chapter 4, if you remember, she decided that she was going to risk it all. Her life, everything she had, she was going to risk it all to just try to help save her people. She understood that it could very well be that God had placed her right where she was for such a time as this. And so she boldly concludes at the end of chapter 4 that she is going to go to the king, and she says this famous phrase, "And if I perish, I perish." So the tension is high. It's high. We're reading this story, and I'm telling you, just out of an appreciation for literature, this story is incredible. I mean, it is absolutely, the way the author writes and weaves this together, it is absolutely incredible. I told you last week, we keep getting these cliffhangers over and over again, these cliffhangers. What's going to happen to Esther? We finish reading a chapter and we really have no more answers. Sometimes we have more questions than we had before. And that's what's taking place. So we move out of chapter 4. Here's Esther. She says, I'm going to go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. We get into chapter 5, and the same thing. We don't get an answer. We don't find out, is Esther going to actually save the people of God? Is she going to risk it all, and is she going to find favor? And not only that, the king might kill her right there on the spot, but is he going to grant her request to spare the people of God? So what does she do, right? She goes in, all right? We get a little answer. He extends his scepter, which is a sign of favor for her. So she's allowed to come in. He says to Esther the first time, when she walks into his court before his throne, he says, what's your request? Basically, why are you here? Why have you come to see me? What do you want? Ask of me up into half of my kingdom, and I will grant it to you. We think, just again, if we place ourselves in the middle of the story, we would go, okay, Esther, tell him what you want. He's just told you, up to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you. Give him your request. And what does she do? She kind of plays him along. She says, well, will you come to my feast that I'd like to prepare for you, and bring your right-hand man, Haman, with you? And so they go to this feast, and they go through these banquets, and the king asks her a second time, ask of me anything you would wish. Anything. What's your request? Up to half of my kingdom, and I'll give it to you. And you kind of think, all right, now she's buttered him up, right? I mean, she's fed him good food. She's given him good wine. She's treated him like a king. We know Xerxes, he is the most powerful man in the world. Chapter 1, he had just finished a 6-month-long feast. I mean, this is his love language, okay? And so she's speaking it to him. So we're, all right, ask, Esther, ask for him to spare your people. But what does she do? Well, she invites him to yet another feast. And this goes on. And so we end chapter 6 with this taking place. And 3 times the king offers to give her what she wants, and she strings him along. She plays him along. She's continually reeling him in a little bit closer, a little bit closer. And we're kind of asking the question, at least I am, is Esther afraid? Like, is she scared to ask? Is she scared, or is this some grand plan of hers? And I don't know that we ever really get an answer, but what we do know is now 3 times the king has said publicly in front of other peoples, ask me whatever it is that you want. Make your request to me, and up to half of my kingdom, I'll make it come true. And so this is a man of great pride. We know that. We've seen that already in his life and in the way that he conducts himself. And so we know that now he's prime. He's already said 3 times he'll do this for Esther, whatever it is that she requests. And so she's got him right where she wants him. And so we're thinking at the end, kind of at the end of or not the end of chapter 5, but kind of in verse 8 of chapter 5, we're thinking, all right, it's going to take place. She's going to make her request. She's going to save the day. She's going to be the hero, and the people of God will be spared. And then all of a sudden, chapter 5, verse 9, we get kind of another snapshot of another scene. And it's Haman leaving this feast, and it says that he is joyful and glad of heart. Basically, he's a little tipsy, probably at least. I mean, he's been feasting and he's been drinking and he's going home, and he's feeling really, really good about himself. Because not only has he been promoted to second in command, but the queen herself has been inviting him along with the king to these feasts. And so he's leaving the palace, he's headed home, but what happens? Well, he sees Mordecai sitting at the gate. So here's this other man who has the ego of 100 men at least or more, and Mordecai's sitting there, and Mordecai doesn't rise in his presence. Mordecai doesn't cower in fear. Remember, these are enemies. Not only enemies in this moment, but their families have been enemies for years and years and years, all the way back to King Saul. And what happens? Haman's angry. All of a sudden, all of those things that he's received, his promotion, his favor in the king's palace, his authority, all of a sudden that means absolutely nothing to him, because this one man won't cower, won't rise in respect. And all of that, and he goes home and he tells them all that. He recounts to them all of these things, all his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions, how he's advanced above everybody else. And he says, but none of that is worth a dime, because this one guy won't cower, won't rise, won't give me the time of day. This is the kind of pride and arrogance that is in the heart of this man named Haman. And so Zeresh, who is Haman's wife, enters the picture, and she says, well, here's what you ought to do, Haman. Build some gallows, 75 feet tall, and hang Mordecai on them. That will, it's kind of freaking me out, Santa Claus back here. So, it's not every day you see Santa in the cry room. Merry Christmas, all right. Well, So she says, build these gallows and hang Mordecai on them. Go to the king and tell him this is what you want to be done. And it says at the end of chapter 5, this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So we come into chapter 6. That's where we left off last week. We come into chapter 6, and we're once again at a kind of cliffhanger moment. What's going to happen? We thought in chapter 5 it's going to be resolved. Esther is going to get her wish. She's going to get the people of God saved. But now, maybe that's true. Maybe that's going to happen. But now we're beginning to worry, is it going to be too late? Is Haman going to go ahead and have Mordecai hanged? Did she wait too long? Has she missed her opportunity? And so as we begin chapter 6, we're anticipating, we're hoping that God is going to show up and save Mordecai, Esther, and their people. But we just don't know. Because Esther doesn't know about this plan, does she? She doesn't know what Haman has decided to do. She doesn't know that he's building these gallows and he's going to have Mordecai hanged upon them. So how in the world is she even going to stop it? Here you have this guy that we saw last week, and he is the epitome of a foolish, arrogant egomaniac. He is everything we hate, absolutely hate about prideful, self-centered people. He embodies that person who lives for his own power, who lives for his own self, his own pleasure. He wants to advance himself. And yet, if we don't know the rest of the story, it appears as if Haman, this prideful, arrogant man, this scum of a man, is going to get his way. Mordecai will be hanged, and the people of God will be annihilated. So Haman, he's so sure of himself. He hasn't even made this request to the king yet, but he's so sure of himself that he goes ahead and he has his men build the 75-foot gallows in his backyard, all in one night. And I'm telling you something, that's impressive. It's impressive. I built a 6-foot tall playset in my backyard several years ago, and it took me months. So he has enough of a construction crew to go into his backyard and build a 75-foot gallows to have Mordecai hanged upon it. And by the way, I didn't mention this. This isn't like a noose hanging. This is an impaled hanging. They're going to impale Mordecai. Basically, it's a 70-foot tall stake that he's going to be impaled upon and hung there for everyone to see. This is what this guy is doing. So we're asking that question, all right? Is this going to take place? How's God going to do this? How's Esther going to save the day? How's Mordecai going to survive? So far, God hasn't really showed up like we'd want him to. And isn't that, I just pause for a moment and look at our own lives. Isn't that often how we feel in our own lives? I mean, we can see it in our minds, how it all should play out. Well, God, you should do this, and this should happen, and then this should happen, and then my life is exactly how I've always envisioned it. We have the picture, and then when things don't play out the way that we anticipated them or the way that we thought they should, we begin to ask the question, well, God, where are you? God, why aren't you bringing the resolution that I longed for? Why aren't you providing for us in the way that I thought you would provide? Why are you letting things spiral out of control? Why, God? We don't understand what he's up to. We can't see his hand. And I love this quote by Charles Spurgeon. This is what he said. He said, God is too good to be unkind. He is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. And so many times I think, if I'm like a lot of people, I find myself, and I think you might find yourself at times in your life, looking for the hand of God, looking for the work of God in your life. How's God going to bring good out of this? How's he going to fix this? How's he going to make it right? Let's be real for a minute. At one time or another, we've probably all been in a similar place. Well, this is where we find ourselves over and over again in the story of Esther. We don't see his hand. It seems like Haman and Xerxes are the ones in control. It seems like they're the ones who are directing everything that's taking place. We don't understand why God has allowed what he's allowed. But we need to be reminded in this story and in our story. This is principle number 1 on your handout. We need to be reminded in this story and in our own story that it's not over. It's not over. The story isn't over. Hear that this evening. The story of Esther isn't over, and your story isn't over. It's not. Look at chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. First sentence. On that night, the king could not sleep. We find out in chapter 6 at the very beginning that King Xerxes is having some trouble sleeping that very night. Coincidence? I don't know. I like to think that maybe he couldn't sleep because of the noise from Haman's construction crew building his gallows, and they're keeping him awake with all the hammering and cutting and dropping and yelling at each other. And I like to think that that's just an even cherry on top of the ironic twist that we're going to find here in a moment. That he couldn't sleep because of what was taking place out there. And so what does he do? Read on with me. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So you might think, all right, here's King Xerxes. You might think that the king, if he can't sleep, well, what's he going to do? Well, you might think he'll call in some of his beautiful women for entertainment. Or maybe he'll call in some of his finest chefs to cook him a fantastic feast. Maybe he'll go on a walk through his extravagant palace. He's got all the options in the world. And what does he do? Well, he calls his servants and he says, bring in the book of memorable deeds and read it to me. Basically, King Xerxes, and some of you will get this joke, has just called Ben Stewart, the financial guy, into his royal bedroom and said, read me your spreadsheets. That's what the book of memorable deeds was. It was dates, events, people, outcomes, all listed. All listed. It was a chronological order of things that had taken place in the king. So-and-so traded this amount of grain for this amount of gold, or this took place on this date with this person. It was transactions, and it was things that had happened that they just happened to record in this book of memorable events. And so this is what he has brought in to read to him. Now, we can all figure it out. Why would he do that? Well, you want an instantaneous way to go to sleep? Have somebody start reading spreadsheets to you, right? I mean, you're out in a minute. So he has them come in. Maybe this is soothing to him, or this is so boring that it's just going to dull him right to sleep. But it doesn't work, does it? Here you have the most powerful king of the time, and he could not sleep at just the right time. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's going on? What's going on? Is it a coincidence? Is it just mere happenstance that the king that night couldn't sleep? And we kind of tend to categorize life, don't we? We kind of tend to categorize our life, elements of our life, like these things are important and these things are unimportant, and these things have spiritual value and these things don't. And while there's some truth to that, one of the things that we see in this book is that God is at work in some of the most insignificant seeming things. So You tell me you come to church on Sunday morning and I say, hey, Luke, how are you? Or, Jeremy, how you doing this morning? Oh, last night was terrible. I just couldn't sleep. And we just kind of go past seemingly insignificant events like that and think they have no purpose or why is this happening? And what we see here is that God is behind the scenes. You're going to see it in chapter 6. And there's a reason why King Xerxes couldn't sleep that night. And there's a reason why he called his servants to read to him the memorable events, the book of memorable events. There's a reason for all of this that's taken place. And we can trace it back through. I won't do it tonight, but you can trace it back through all of the story. Seemingly insignificant events. But yet God is at work. That's principle number 2, and we've already seen it in our study. God is always at work, even in the seemingly insignificant. The things that we don't think twice about. God's at work. He's up to something. He's doing something. Don't discount those things. We see that all over this. Look on at verse 2. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So he was read what was recorded back early in the book. He was read that Mordecai had saved his life by telling of this plot to overthrow the king, to assassinate the king. And if you remember, it was noted earlier in Esther that Mordecai was never rewarded. He was never honored. And it's so interesting because we read that in the story and we thought to ourselves, and we noted that, if you were here with us that night when we studied through that, we noted that it was very interesting that all of a sudden this story's inserted of how Mordecai saves the king's life, and then it's told to us that he was never honored, he was never rewarded. And at the moment, we're asking the question, well, why not? Why was Mordecai not rewarded? Why didn't it happen? Mordecai was probably thinking, man, I just risked my neck to save the king's life, and I got nothing out of it. And again, how often do we do the right thing in life and then either we don't get rewarded or something bad happens in return and we go, oh man, why did I do the right thing? And yet, here's the principle that I see here, number 3. God's timing is perfect. God's timing is perfect. It is always perfect. So we, in the midst of the story, are looking at it going, wow, why didn't this happen now or then, or why didn't it happen? And all of a sudden we're getting a glimpse in chapter 6. That's why Mordecai wasn't rewarded back when he saved the king's life, because it's going to come and it's going to play a very important role now, in this moment in time. God's timing is always perfect. So chapter 3, King Xerxes asks the great question, what was done? What do we do to honor this man? And the answer was nothing. And why would this have been the king's first thought? Why would Xerxes have immediately thought, oh my goodness, here we have this guy who foiled this assassination attempt. And why would his first thought have been, well, what was done for him? Well, let me tell you. If you know anything about ancient history, it wasn't very uncommon for there to be lots of assassination attempts upon kings and rulers and leaders. Why? Because it's the same today. People want power. People want power. So they think, if we can overthrow the king, maybe I can be king. Or we can install the king that we want, who will do what we want. And so there were always assassination attempts and plots and plans that were taking place. People wanted power. And so it was not uncommon for kings in that day, especially kings in Persia, it was not uncommon for them to reward good deeds because, number one, they knew that it would promote morale, it would promote good morale for those who were loyal to the king, and it would continue to encourage loyalty. If nothing was done for Mordecai, what was going to be the incentive for the next guy who overheard an assassination plot? If nothing good happened to Mordecai, they're going to go, well, what? Maybe it would be best if that king wasn't king anymore. And so it was something that the kings prided themselves in, to take care of those who were loyal unto them. And so the first thought in Xerxes' mind is this: what honor was given to this man? And they told him, nothing. There's another historical account that tells us there was a time when someone saved the life of the brother of the king. And he was rewarded as governor over an entire province. That's how it worked, and it kind of works that way now, right? Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's the same thing back in the kingdom of Persia. And so he took care of the king's brother, the king took care of him and placed him in a position of authority. But Mordecai got absolutely nothing. So then look on at verse 4. So the king said, look at what he says in verse 4. He finds out that nothing's been done for Mordecai. And so he says in verse 4, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Again, at just the right time, Xerxes, it's probably early in the morning because he can't sleep. At just the right time, Haman happens to enter the court to go to speak to King Xerxes about having Mordecai hanged. Xerxes has just read the account of how Mordecai has saved his life. Haman has this great plan, and you can almost just imagine the smirk on his face. He's on his way to take care of this one. Oh, I'm gonna show you for not cowering before me, or for not rising before me and showing me the respect my authority is due. And so he's coming in and he's got his gallows built and he's ready to put Mordecai upon it. And oh, how the tables turn for Haman. By the way, I've titled this message Haman's Bad Day. You kind of know where this is headed, right? Haman is about to have the worst day of his life. So he gets called in. Haman happens to be in the court. The king calls him in. Look at verse 5. The king's young men told him, Haman's there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. Verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? I love it. I realize this is my favorite chapter in all of Esther. Esther chapter 6. Haman thinks to himself, well, the king wants to honor someone. Well, who would he want to honor more than me? This is the pride. There's no humility there, right? The king says, what should I do to honor this one? And Haman thinks, oh, I'm that guy. The king wants to honor me. The king wants to promote me again. And so look at what he says. Verse 7. And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, verse 8, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn himself, and the horse that the king has ridden. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Look on in verse 11. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and he led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Oh, this story just gets better. It just gets sweeter. The sudden reversal The ironic, or better stated, the providential twists in this story are absolutely stunning. We talked about this last week and a couple of weeks before that. God is the great reverser of destiny. Ultimately, for those of us who put our trust in Christ, our destiny is reversed from death to life, from sin to righteousness, from light to dark. I mean, you pick the comparison the Scripture uses. That's the great reversal of destiny. This story is a little bit of a shadow of that, but you see these reversals over and over again. And it's not just a coincidence. It's not just ironic. It's the providential hand of God. And you noticed it there at the end of the chapter. Haman's wife and his wise men, what do they say to him at the very end in verse 13? They say, if Mordecai, they begin to recognize it, don't they? If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall. So the man that all of a sudden you wanted hung on the gallows and you wanted his people annihilated, now all of a sudden you are on a trajectory downwards. You're falling before him. If he is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Now, most scholars, when they read that text and they study that in the original language, they recognize that the wise men in Zeresh, maybe they knew of the stories of Exodus. Maybe they knew of the Jewish people in Egypt. Maybe they knew of all of the stories of how people had opposed the people of God and it did not end well for them. That's what they assume they're talking about there, saying, oh, he's of the Jewish people. Oh, he's one of God's people. It's not going to end well for you, Haman. It's not going to end well for you. They are recognizing the providential hand of God, and they see the writing on the wall that Haman is in trouble. He's in trouble. He's humiliated before the entire city. He has to parade Mordecai around, proclaiming, this is the man the king delights to honor. Let me give you principle number 4. God always gets the last word. God always gets the last word. He does. He does. We know how Haman felt about Mordecai. We know his plans for Mordecai and the people of God. But the king says to Haman, leave nothing out that you said. Honor this man. Haman's probably rethinking his answer at this point. Oh gosh, I shouldn't have said that. You know, I shouldn't have given all of this to him. The 5th principle that I think we see here is that pride really does come before the fall. This is a case. This is an example. This is an absolute case of pride coming before the fall. Haman is a prime example of that. It also reminds me of another passage, Psalm chapter 2. And I'm not going to read it tonight, but I encourage you to go back because it talks about how the kings and the rulers of this world, they set themselves against God in their pride, in their desire to be against the Lord and his anointed. And it says in Psalm chapter 2 that the Lord just laughs at them. He just laughs. Because he looks down at these who think they have all the power in the world, who think that they can overcome God and God's people, and it says that God just laughs. And I see that. I see that here in Esther chapter 6. It doesn't say God is laughing at Haman, but the providential twist in this story, it's just like God saying, Haman, you're not in control. You're not the one in power. You've set yourself and your people against my people, and this is what's going to happen. Pride really does come before the fall. He had to publicly parade him through the city, declaring the king's honor for Mordecai. Number 6, last point, last principle I see in this text. You often can't see what God is up to from within the story. You often can't see what God is up to from within the story. Take any of these things that have happened so far. Take any of them. Esther. Somehow her parents die. She's adopted by her relative Mordecai. They're in exile. They chose not to go back to Jerusalem like many of the other Jews. They stayed in Persia. She's chosen out from among the beautiful young virgins in the land to be a part of the king's harem. He's going to select his new queen. Even before that, Vashti, she refuses to go in and parade herself before. You take all of these instances by themselves, and you don't see it, right? You don't see the hand of God. You just see a situation. You see something that takes a place. So by itself, it wouldn't seem that out of the ordinary. But you begin to string them all together. All of these events that we've seen so far through chapter 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And it screams off the page, someone is behind all of this. This is more than just random chance or coincidence. This has been in the works for quite some time. Well, what is it? It's what we've started our study off with. It's what's called the providence of God. Providence is the way that God directs the flow of human history through the ordinary lives of individuals to fulfill his purposes, his promises. Sometimes God chooses to act through the miraculous, through the supernatural. But actually, more often, God works through providence, through normal, everyday events and actions and decisions. God is at work. You see and you highlight these miraculous things because they're out of the ordinary. That's what you see even in the scripture. But there are long spans of time, even in the Bible and that we see today, where God's not always doing the miraculous or the supernatural. Sometimes he is just ordering everyday, ordinary events, decisions, and actions to fulfill his purposes for his people. You can't often see what God is up to from within the story, but time is a great revealer of the hand and the work of God. And so let that be an encouragement to you this evening. I don't know where everybody is in the room, but I would imagine that there are some of you that you're having a hard time seeing what God's doing in your life right now. I'd imagine that that's true. Maybe not all the way across your life. Maybe it's just a certain situation. And you look at that situation and it consumes your thoughts and it consumes your mind and your heart is in it, and you're struggling to make sense of what God is doing. You have an area in your life where you've been waiting for God to show up, but it looks like he's nowhere to be found. Maybe there's an area of your life where you feel like God's forgotten you. You feel like he's too busy and he's got all these other things, and we struggle. We struggle to trust him when we can't see, don't we? We do. When we can't make sense of it, when we can't see what he's up to, we struggle when we can't see him. That's why we're always trying to figure out. You talk to people all the time. I just want to know what God's will is. I just want to know. You're struggling with a decision. I just want to know what his will is. Because when we can't see that, we struggle to trust. We struggle to make sense. That's why we're trying to figure out what he's up to. It makes it easier for us to trust. So how do you apply this lesson tonight? I would boil it down to one simple thing. Trust God no matter what. I know it's simple, and it's really easy to say. Trust God no matter what. Yes, Nathan. No matter what, though. Whether you see his hand, whether you see his work, or whether you don't. Fall back on the word of God and the truths that we find here, knowing that he is going to fulfill his purposes. He is going to fulfill his promises. You may not see it in this life, but ultimately, the story's not over. It's not over even when I die, when you die. He is going to fulfill his purposes and his promise. Trust no matter what.